This is Dave with Taboo Customs. This video is going to be a video in a series of videos we're doing on a green Cherokee where we're installing 1-ton axles, custom long arm front suspension, a Dana 300 and some MRAP seats. This video specifically is going to cover the front axle, what we're doing to prepare that front axle to go into the Jeep. We're going to cover some disassembly of the axle, some inspection of the axle, the Eaton E Locker install, the 513 gear install, and also our our high steering arm install on top of the kingpin knuckles. Now, if you're looking for the actual suspension install, the design and the welding of the lower control arm brackets, the upper control arm brackets, all that we're going to put in the suspension video, which will be a different video than this one that you can search our YouTube page to find if you're looking for that video. So let's take a look at the disassembly of this axle. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull the cover off. We're going to take a look at what this axle looks like inside. Now we're replacing pretty much everything on the inside of the axle, so it's not a huge deal, but if it is full of rust, I kind of want to know now so that we can start planning on getting it cleaned out. Then we're also going to pull the hubs off of the outside, the calipers, everything out, and then we're going to pull the axle shafts, because the first thing I do want to check before I order a locker for this is I want to verify that it has 35 spline axles. I'm pretty certain that it does, but there are 30 spline axle shafts for the Dana 60s and a lot of 60s, and there's 35 spline, so I want to make sure I verify that before I go in and buy an expensive locker. Alright, so I didn't know what we were getting into as we opened this up. So one of the things I'm going to do also is, as you can see, it has a lunchbox type locker in it already, which I don't know if the owner realized or not. I'm going to check the gear ratio too to see what gear ratio it is before we buy gears. Overall, it looks pretty good. It has had some water in it. You can see a lot of moisture in it. It was drained. I didn't even know if it was drained or not. So now we're going to take a look and figure out what gear ratio it is, and then we're going to pull apart the outer hubs and pull those axle shafts out so that we can check and see what spline they are. Alright, so to check the ratio, what we're doing here is we spun the ring gear around until we ran into the series of numbers on the ring gear here, and you're going to run into a couple of numbers here at the end, and they typically can be kind of hard to find if you've got all those numbers and you're not used to looking for them, but once you kind of understand what they look like, you can find them pretty easily. What they are, this is a tooth count, so you've got 41 and 9, so that means you've got 41 teeth on the ring gear, 9 teeth on the pinion gear, which means that these are 456 gears. Now, this is a pretty decent gear set for this axle. However, I'm pretty sure that the rear axle has 513 gears in it, so we're going to crack that one open as well, and we're going to check what that gear set is before we go and order our gears. Alright, so the next step is we're going to disassemble the outer wheel hubs here, which shouldn't be too difficult. Now, these Dana 60s will all be pretty much the same. First, we'll have to take the lockout out of the outside. We'll have a couple of sets of nuts on the inside. Then you'll have your outer wheel bearing and your inner wheel bearing, and your inner wheel bearing will come off with the hub and the caliper here as we pull that whole assembly off. Once we get all that out, we can pull out the axle shafts and we can count the splines. Alright, so we've taken the wheel hub off, and really it's not too difficult, and this one's been well maintained, it looks like, so it was pretty easy, pulling the lockout out with the, you take out the bolts on the outside, and then you've got a couple of snap rings. You've got an outside snap ring, then an inside snap ring that's on the axle shaft. Then you do need a special socket for the nuts that are down in there, and like I said, there's 2 nuts in there. and then a lock washer in between those nuts, and then pretty much the whole hub will just pull off. Once you get to that point, then we'll have to take off these 5 bolts here around the spindle, then the caliper bracket, and the spindle will come off, and then we'll use a piece of wood to get the spindle off, because whenever we hit this with the hammer, we definitely don't want to mess up the threads or the bearing surfaces here as we take it off. Now in setting up to press the bearing onto our new pinion, one thing we noticed is that our kit didn't come with a new slinger, so we're going to have to pull this bearing off to get that slinger. And another thing to also watch for with these rear end setups is that sometimes the pinion depth bearings will be underneath this bearing. In our setup, they're actually underneath the race, and that's where we're going to be putting them, is back under the race. So in some cases, you might want to pull this off just to see how big the pinion depth pack is underneath that bearing. So we're going to go ahead and pull that bearing off, get our slinger, and then press our new bearing and that slinger onto the new pinion. Alright, so we're over at our cheap little Harbor Freight shop press, and I always think I should get a better press, but honestly I don't use it that often, and it seems to do the job. Alright, so we've got our pinion all ready to go. Next step for that is pressing in our races. We've got some tools that we've made over the years, obviously, of doing a lot of these that we're going to use to press these in. It's actually made out of an old race and a piece of tube, and we'll kind of show you that. Of course, pressing in the bottom race, you got to make sure you put your pinion depth shims in first. If you forget those, you'll be pressing it back or pushing it back out. Chances are you're going to have to take this bottom one in and out anyway if you have to redo those that pinion depth. So the biggest thing with this is getting it in there square. If it doesn't go in square, it's going to be really hard. So you really need to focus on making sure that as you hit it, you get it going in as square as you can. And then the big thing is making sure that you get it bottomed out all the way in the housing. And once you do enough of these, you can kind of tell whenever you're bottoming out, whenever you hit whatever it is you're driving it in with, the sound will be different, the feel will be different. It'll feel a lot solid, very solid. So we got that one driven in. Now we use our other punch here and drive in the other side. So now that the races are in, it's time to go ahead and put the pinion back in. So we went ahead, we grabbed the old shim pack from the old pinion, and we're just going to use that for now. We'll get that pinion put up in place. For the time being, and like I said, we make a lot of tools to help ourselves with these, and I actually have a setup bearing for this upper bearing, because if you don't have a setup bearing, you'll have to keep pushing this pinion in and out through a bearing that is really a press fit, and it can be kind of a pain. I mean, it's doable, but it's easier if you have a setup bearing for this upper bearing here. We'll also show you in a minute how we have setup bearings for the carrier as well, because we're going to have to take those on and off to do the shims. So we're going to use the setup bearing here. The original yoke doesn't want to fit very well. And this is an issue you run into sometimes where the yoke just doesn't want to go on very easy. So unfortunately, you just have to take a hammer, help it to get on there. You want to make sure that you get the pinion to where you have a couple of threads that you can start threading your nut onto, because you don't want to strip those threads out on top of the pinion. So we've got enough threads here, but we don't have enough threads to get our washer. So we're going to go ahead and start our nut, get a little ways on, take it off, put our washer on, and put the nut back on. Now, it's also pretty important that reuse your old nut just for the setup. Put the new nut on the very last thing. These nuts are also lock nuts, and so pretty much one-time use for that feature. So typically when you pull these nuts off, they do recommend that you replace them, but you know, we've pulled them off and used them before, but we do always put that new nut on last if we do have a new nut. Alright, so we've got everything back together, and we put the preload shims in there because we don't want to get this so tight that it can't turn. You want to be able to easily turn it, but not have it loose either, because as we go to do the setup and we're going to be checking the pinion depth, you want to be able to use this to drive the carrier but not have it hit both sides whenever you spin it. So you want it to be a little bit stiff, but not loose, as we mentioned. So as we mentioned, we talked about setup bearings a minute ago, and this is where it's going to be really critical probably to have some setup bearings. And if you need to make some setup bearings, what you can do is you can take some bearings and die grind the inside out until they roughly slip over the carrier without too much friction. You know, you want them to be tight on there because you don't want it to be loose, but you still want it to be able to slide on and off, because there's a good chance that you're going to be changing that backlash to start out. So we've already got our setup bearings, we've already made our shim packs, so we'll go ahead and we'll work on getting this carrier back in. Now, one thing on the shim packs is we didn't end up exactly at the right exact measurements that we came out with, just with the shims that were available in our master kit there. So we did end up adding a little bit to one side and we took away the other side. So that should keep our preload hopefully the same, but we'll have to check that as we put it in. Alright, so we weren't on camera when we first got this set up here. I didn't hit the record button apparently, right? But we've gone through one setup already. We've put in the correct shims that we wanted to get in there, and we ended up with about 0.003 backlash, and backlash is going to be the distance between the gears, and we measure that with a dial indicator here. So since then we've done another setup when we actually added some preload too, because you want this to be, without a case spreader, you're going to want this to be kind of difficult to get in. It's unfortunate, but that's how, you know, you can make sure that you set some preload on those bearings, and you need to make sure you do not have any movement at all back and forth with this carrier in here. So we've got this set, and we're about 0.11 backlash. Now that's a little bit higher than what we're looking for. We're looking for 6 to 10, but we're not going to change the backlash just yet. Now we're going to check the pinion depth to see if the pinion needs to move in or out, because if the pinion needs to move closer to the ring gear, our backlash is going to also probably go down, or it's going to change in one way or another. So let's take a look at our pattern. Alright, now to check the pattern, one thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to put some pressure on this ring gear, because you want to use the pinion to drive the ring gear. You don't want that backlash to be going back and forth. So you want to force the pinion to actually move the ring gear so you can get good contact. Make sure you run it through and then go back the other way. Okay, so now what we're looking for, and I'll try to bring it in there, is we're looking for a pattern that is mainly centered between the heel and the outside of this tooth, basically the top and the bottom of the tooth. I mean, we'd also probably, it'd be nice to see this pattern centered this way, but you can see here how the pattern is pretty well centered, and it's not necessarily crescent shaped. If it's crescent shaped, that's typically what's bad. It's either too deep or it's too close. So we can see on this one that actually it's, right now it's pretty good. It's centered on both sides pretty well, and it's pretty well got a decent sized pattern from the base of the tooth to the top of the tooth. So with that, then, it looks like what we'll do next is we'll go ahead and we'll adjust that backlash just a little bit to try to get it down just a hair. So we're just going to make a minor change in the backlash. Our preload is pretty good, so we're going to try to stay around the same total number between our passenger and our driver side. And we'll just go ahead and change that backlash, move the carrier over a little bit, and recheck our pattern. Alright, so we got the carrier in again, and one thing I should have mentioned is I do recommend getting a brass copper hammer, something that's a little softer, and you have to be careful that you don't hit like this ring here very hard, and you've got the little tabs down here that you also have to be careful of because of the way this locker is designed. So be careful of all those different items, and just tap it in, and if it's not going in square, you're going to have to stop, pull it out, and start again. But just keep it square to the carrier or to the case, and tap it in and get it in. And if these caps will not thread in easily, do not try to force them in either. You definitely don't want to cross thread anything. So we'll grab our dial indicator, check our backlash. Unfortunately, we went a little bit too far, so now we've got to back it off a little bit. We added 10 thousandths on this side, moved it over, which I thought might be a little bit much. Some problems with you're going to run into if you buy different kits, they're only going to come with a certain amount of shims. So we're going to have to go through, and of course we've got a bunch of old kits, and what we do is we'll just keep the leftovers from the old kits, and we're going to have to go through these shims here and probably find some thinner shims and change our back spacing a little bit. But you want to make sure you get it right. Unfortunately, this might mean in and out several times. Alright, so it looks like we've reached the final setup here as far as being on the setup bearings and everything. We've ended up with about 9 thousandths backlash, and we've got a pattern that it looks really good. It's centered not only from the the tooth in this direction, but also from the top to the bottom of the tooth. And so we're good with our pattern. We're good with our backlash. But the thing is, we're not done. We've got to go and got to put our new bearings on here. Now we're going to want to recheck everything just to make sure that we didn't get anything off whenever we're putting this back together. The other thing we're going to need to do before we do the final assembly on this is we're going to have to drill our hole for our electronics. So we'll be doing that here in just a minute, but first we're going to have to pull this back apart. So the hole for the electronics, and this is something that the instruction book doesn't really give you a good idea on. It has to obviously be on this side because the wires are so short. Now on different axles are going to end up in different places. On the Dana 60 here, you should be able to drill a hole right here along this little area just to this side of the vent. Now some Dana 60s have a little bit thicker flange and have a little bit more area also in that area, in that spot, but on this one you've only got about a ½ inch, so you got to be really close up to this this face here to be able to get that hole in there and come out clean without hitting that big piece of casting on the other side. So we've gone in, already put ourselves a little pilot dimple in here, and then we're going to go in with a ½ inch drill bit and drill through this. Now before you do that, you're going to want to make sure that all of your parts are clear from the area, because you're going to be making a lot of chips, and then we're going to have to go in and also clean up the inside once we're done. Alright, so I'll try to show you the hole we've created now. So we'll go in and we will take a look at that from the inside, and we'll need to clean up all of our chips. Here's the inside. You can see how close we end up getting to everything there. So you have to make sure that you really try to lay that hole out early on, and make sure it doesn't get into this boss here, or make sure you stay away from the the thing over here. We're pretty close to it here, but we should still be good. Trying to stay away from this vent and everything. It's kind of a pain to get it in this this model Dana 60. Alright, so before we get to pressing the carrier bearings onto our carrier, we got to remove our pinion here, put our new pinion bearing in on this upper section, and then we'll also set our preload, and we'll install our new pinion seal as well. So first we got to take all this back apart, unfortunately. So we've got this back together and setting the preload, I mean, we can tell that it's got way too much preload. What we use to set the preload, and we're looking for a preload from about 15 to 30 inch-pounds, and so we've got a dial style torque wrench here, and we can see that we're up around 45 to 50 inch-pounds. So we've got too much preload on there, so unfortunately now we've got to take it all back apart, add some preload shims to it, put it back together, check it again until we get our preload set right. Once we get the preload set right, we'll go ahead and pull this yoke back off, put our seal on here, and then put our new nut along with some Loctite, and then torque everything down. preload set up. Now all we need to do is put our washer back on there, and then we will need to put our new pinion seal in there. First we're going to lubricate it a little bit. We don't want it to get tore up. We can put our yoke back on. And this time we're going to use our new nut. This is a top lock nut, so that's why you can only really use that feature once. We're going to go ahead and put some Loctite on there too, because you know, pinion nuts are one thing that can have a habit of backing off, so you don't want it to back off. We'll get it all tightened up. Alright, so we're ready to install the carrier now. We've already pressed our bearings on. Now, one thing to remember when you're pressing these bearings on, typically the inner bearing race here goes past the carrier, so you can't just press it flush to that top face of that carrier. You're going to need to use something to press it down farther around that carrier. Now, we've got a special tool we've made to do that, but you can also use one of the old bearings to go around that and press it farther down. Just make sure you get it all the way seated, because if you don't, it will cause problems. So we'll go ahead and reassemble it and recheck everything, and hopefully we're still good. Alright, so we've double checked everything. Everything is good to go. We'll need to go ahead and route our wires here. Before we finish up, we'll probably pull this cap, route the wires a little bit easier with the cap off of there. Then we will put Loctite. We'll clean up our bolts, put Loctite on them, torque them down to 80 foot-pounds, and we are pretty much done with the E Locker installation. So one last thing to remember with this E Locker is this hole up here. You're going to want to take your RTV, make sure you seal up that hole really good. You don't want, you know, you can also take a pair of pliers and pull this rubber just to make sure it's locked in to that hole good, and then seal it up so you don't want any water getting in through that hole. Then pretty much you're all set up. We can go ahead and put the cover on. In our next step, we're going to be looking at pulling the kingpin covers off and installing our high steer arms. Alright, for one of the last things we're going to do to this axle to get it prepped, and that's going to be to pull the old caps off of the kingpins up here and install our new high steer steering arms. Well, I say new, they're used, but and I'm not sure exactly what brand these are. They are pretty quality items. Are extremely thick, and you can see they're drilled for a extra bolt on the kingpin, which is used with reed knuckles, which just doesn't have reed knuckles, so we don't have to worry about that. So what we're going to have to do is remove these bolts, remove this arm, remove these studs, because we're going to need some longer studs, and then we will reinstall these studs and get our arms installed. studs in, we'll take a look at some of the components of the kingpin. So you can see here the large pin in the top, which is why it's called the kingpin. Then around that pin, you've got what's basically a UHMW bushing. Then you've got a washer that pushes down on that with a spring to keep pressure down on that bushing around that pin, which replaces your standard ball joint. As far as the studs, you can see that the studs came out pretty easily, which I'm really happy with that. We did have to double nut one stud to be able to pull it out, but still, we really didn't have a hard time once it got double nutted. Here you can kind of see the difference between the two studs that we're using. The new studs are a good ½ inch longer and on the top, and a good probably ½ inch longer on the bottom. So overall longer because they have to deal with this almost 2-inch block that's going to be going on top of here. Now when we go to install these, we're going to want to make sure we put a lot of Loctite on the threads that are going down into the knuckle. The reason for that is that being these are going to be for steering, there's a good chance that if you don't use Loctite, they will back off on you. So make sure you use a lot of Loctite, and we also will need to seal up this area around here. Now we don't have any gaskets right here for this, so we're just going to go ahead and RTV it and get those reinstalled. And now for the fun part, and that's getting these arms up over on top of those studs. And this is where it probably helped if you had an extra set of hands. Unfortunately, I don't today, so it's just going to be me. So you all can watch me struggle with it for a while. The biggest thing is going to be we'll probably pull the spring out of that end so we don't drop it everywhere and get crap all over it. And we'll try to get this side up on there and then work on that side since this side has both the arms on it. Probably be easier if I took those arms off, but I don't know. I feel like a glutton for punishment today, I guess. Well, not so bad. So the next step is we have to try to compress that spring so that we can put the nuts on the top here. Because these blocks are so tall, we're not going to have but maybe a ½ inch sticking up above those. So we're going to need to use a large C-clamp, which it's easiest to go behind the knuckle so you can get pretty well underneath it squarely. And then make sure it goes down square and even, or else it'll bind up and get you held up. We're going to go ahead and put it down as far as we can. And then we're going to realize that we forgot to put some sort of sealant underneath here. So don't forget to put your sealant under there, because now we have to pull all this off. We're going to put a little RTV, or you can get gaskets that fit there. But we got to RTV that, and we'll have to put it back on to get this all done. Alright, so now we can take our 4 nuts, and they basically look just like cheap lug nuts. We'll put some Loctite on those as well, and we'll install them. And then we'll tighten them down to 80 foot-pounds, and we'll end up making sure, you know, we go in a cross pattern there and get the torque even. So one thing I noticed on these Heister arms, since they're so tall, we don't really have any thread sticking up above these nuts with the stud screwed all the way into the knuckles. So since we have a little bit extra, screw that, ignore that, Holly. One thing I noticed I don't like on this is that whenever we get done here, we notice we have no thread sticking up above the high steer arms. It's pretty much, you've got about 1 or 2 threads showing at the top of the nut. Not something that is the greatest situation. You normally want threads to show up here, so we're probably going to have to look for some taller studs for these. Well, that does it for our prep video for the front axle for our Project XJ that we're working on here. Make sure you tune into our other videos to see the installation of this. We still have a few things that we're going to do to it before we install it. We will be welding these tubes here to the center section, probably removing some brackets, but we'll do all that whenever we work on the suspension in that video. So thank you for watching, and as always, a like or subscribe is appreciated.